Good evening. Can you all hear me okay? Good evening. Lovely to have you all here. My name is Luann Greenwald. I'm the director of the Hilliard University Art Museum and want to welcome you to our 5th annual John Bartholomew's Bienvenu lecture. This is our annual signature event for the Hilliard Museum, and I have a number of people I want to thank who all have contributed to this this evening. First of all, top of the list, Gloria Calais. Gloria, thank you so much for making this possible. Gloria made an endowed gift in honor of her brother, John Bartholomew Bienvenu, who was an artist, psychologist, and just a well-loved member of our community, a father. Some of the family is here. It really means a lot to have all of you with us tonight, and can't thank you enough for making this possible. I also want to say thank you to the Hilliard Society, our top-tier membership group who hosted the lovely reception tonight. Our Hilliard Society members here, raise your hand. Thank you all. Much appreciate your help. Bon Ton Grill provided the refreshments this evening. Also want to say special thanks to Robert and Jolie Shelton, who hosted a lovely luncheon for our guest speaker today. Thank you so much. And of course, my team, Vaughn Simpson and Jeannie Kramer, who are always great assistants with our annual lecture. So thank you, ladies, again. And finally, thank you to Acadiana Open Channel, who is recording the lecture tonight so that more people can enjoy it in the coming weeks. Sure. So, as I mentioned, this annual lecture is named for John Bartholomew Bienvenu. He himself was an artist, a wonderful watercolorist, who influenced many people. I heard people having conversations tonight talking about how they knew John and worked side by side with him. Tonight, our guest speaker is Dr. Janice Simon. She is the, I hope I pronounced this correctly, Josiah Miggs Distinguished Teaching Associate Professor of Art History in the Lamar Dodd School of Art at the University of Georgia in Athens, where she has taught since 1988. Her lecture is titled From North to South, Icons of Mid-19th Century American Landscape Painting, and she'll focus on artists of the antebellum period whose work now defines American landscape painting. Dr. Simon is a specialist in American and modern art and has contributed to many exhibition catalogs and books, as well as journal articles and conference papers on a wide range of subjects in her field. Her dissertation, The Crayon, 1855 to 1861, The Voice of Nature in Criticism, Poetry, and the Fine Arts, still stands as the most important and comprehensive study of America's premier art journal of the antebellum period. She's published as well on the 1870s New York art journal, the Aldine, as well as the role of periodicals in art criticism. In 2010, she served as a guest editor for an issue of American periodicals on American periodicals and visual culture. One of her current book projects is The Crayon, 1855 to 1861, The New Path, 1864, and the Aldine, 1868 to 1879, Nature as Idea and Image in the American Art Periodical Before and After the Civil War. Long title. Yeah, I did a better one. A specialist in American art, especially landscape painting and photography, and its connections with transcendentalism and environmentalism. She was guest curator and principal author of Images of Contentment, John Frederick Kensit and the Connecticut Shore, Mattituck Museum, 2001. And she's written essays on the image of the forest interior in American art, recipient of many university teaching awards, including the Richard Russell Outstanding Undergraduates Teaching Award in its inaugural year, 1992, the National Pan-Hellenic Council's Outstanding Professor Award in 2008, and the university's highest teaching distinction, the Miggs Professorship in 2006. Her teaching interests span not only American art from the 18th century through the 20th century, but also European modernism and spirituality, modernist photography in America and Europe, and the depiction of modern artists in film, and the filmic art of Alfred Hitchcock. Before I turn this over to Janice Simon, Dr. Chris Bennett, our professor of art history here at UL's College of Art, would like to say a few words about his mentor.
All right, good evening. Yeah, thanks for coming out. Of course, it's a great honor to introduce my mentor, my undergraduate mentor in art history, Janice Simon. I thought I'd start out with a few words for the younger people, the students, and the audience about mentors. I would encourage you guys to find mentors, to locate mentors, but to also keep your mentors, to think about these as long-term relationships. As an undergraduate at the University of Georgia, I worked very hard to earn Janice's esteem. She later helped me get my foot in the door at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor for my PhD. And Michigan is top 10 in art history, so not bad for a boy from the University of Georgia, right? Later amazing things followed, a Rome Prize Fellowship, a Getty Fellowship. But the thing about mentors is that they're not only going to be there for you in these really great, exhilarating times, but they'll also be there for you when things get challenging. And most likely, unpredictable, challenging things will happen. And Janice has really been there for me in those times as well. If there's one word that comes to mind for Janice, it's probably revelation. Revelation, just in the sense of going to her classes, just learning so much, day by day, and even minute by minute. She has a real singular commitment, a real passion, a real ardor for her vocation of art history. And again, it's my honor to give you Janice.
Can you get the lights down? Thank you so much, Chris. That meant a lot, and thank you, Luann, and thank you to the Hilliard Museum for bringing me in. This has been great. This is my first visit to Louisiana, and I'm having a great time and experiencing, of course, wonderful Southern hospitality, fantastic lunch, and art collection to see, wonderful silver, and very nice meeting the sponsors of this program. Can we get the lights? Yeah. Okay. Getting them? Yeah. Oh, she's doing it. Okay. All right. Well, I'll start then. It's about that time. It's 7:10. For many of you, this is Jeopardy time. And so let's imagine we're in watching Jeopardy. And if it listed the names Thomas Cole and Frederick Edwin Church, then certainly the winning question would be, who are the two most prominent icons of mid-19th century American landscape painting? And these two iconic paintings of iconic natural features of the North and South America, so we have Niagara Falls and we have the Andes, these two iconic paintings would readily come to mind. They are truly representative works of these two most renowned painters of American landscape painting. There, perfect. And we begin with two portraits. Can everyone hear me all right, by the way? Okay. We begin with two portraits. A self-portrait by Thomas Cole of 1836, a very momentous year for him, and a portrait by Charles Lorien Eliot of his only student, which is interesting because everyone talks about the so-called Hudson River School. Well, there was no school, okay? It did not exist. And in fact, that term Hudson River School was given in the 1880s as a derogatory term. But so now us art historians have to deal with the Hudson River School term all the time. But Thomas Cole never had a school, people didn't come, but he did have one student, and that was Frederick Edwin Church. And he was, and indeed it is Church who will really fulfill, as we'll see, the ideals of Thomas Cole and what landscape painting could be. And what Cole conceived was that the artist was not just an artist, but a poet artist, a philosopher, a historian. And he saw it in this landscape painting that was just now becoming important in 19th century culture in Europe, like England, as well as America, a higher sort of landscape painting, to use his words. And to use what he said, that the subject of art should be pure and lofty, an impressive lesson taught, an important scene illustrated, a moral, religious, or poetic effect be produced on the mind. And here we have the essence, in fact, of Romanticism. And this is what these two artists represent. The idea of the individual subjectivity of the imaginative mind that understands the natural world. Cole was a big fan of geology, which was actually the hobby of the day in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. And then his student, Frederick Edwin Church, became a serious student of botany, geology, water movement, you name it. And combined all that with then an art that was not just scenic, but had this lesson to be taught, this poetic effect, this religious meaning. And it is Church who really fulfills this, as we will see. Cole was not just a painter, in fact, he was also a poet. He was a storyteller. He wrote a story called The Bewilderment, in which he was caught in this cave and of wind and all this, and always danger around in his mind. And he was very much taken with the idea of the mind as the spark of light. Not that the mind received, but the mind illuminated. And this, of course, is a romantic ideal of this time. You think of William Wordsworth, who's very influential, and he talked about recollections in tranquility. Well, Cole, too, thought of that, and then used his imagination to enliven what he had seen and learned. Notice, in his self-portrait, he gives himself a very large, broad forehead. In fact, it was said at the time that his hair started balding because he thought too much. And this gave him, of course, this great forehead, because it was that forehead that in the science of the day, phrenology, that was the forehead of the genius artist. Because that forehead would unite the aesthetic, that is the visual, and the imaginative faculties, and the rational faculties too. For the romantic, the rational was the imaginative. And these, the imaginary and the ideal, to come together and to be harmoniously blended. Now, this idea of oppositions put together and harmonized, we're going to see throughout today as these artists look at the great elements of North and South American visual landscape components. And that is, again, an essence of Romanticism. Now, Cole was as interested in the obscure and the uncertain. And this, too, is visible in the self-portrait. Notice he comes out of the darkness, as it were. And his body is really not important. It is that mind and those eyes staring out at us. Now, Cole understood darkness only too well. Later in his life, his beloved baby daughter Elizabeth died right soon after her birth in 1847. But even before this, as a young man in America, he was actually born in England, Lancashire, England, and came with his family at the age of 17. And he very much had to support his parents and his sisters as they tried to make their way through life in their new nation. They moved about in Ohio as well as in Pennsylvania, including Pittsburgh, from 1819 to 1824. And Cole was not immediately an important painter. He painted wallpaper. He painted designs on food utensils. He designed a scenery, stage scenery, and would paint that. He also was a teacher of drawing. But in 1825, his landscape paintings are discovered. Literally, he's discovered. And he's discovered by two prominent artists in New York City. John Trumbull, who was a colonel from the Revolutionary War, and did this fantastic series of paintings that wind up being done for the Capitol in our United States Capitol. And also Asher B. Duran, an artist who began as a genre painter who would then take up landscape painting thanks to Cole's influence. And so it is through Cole, in fact, that American landscape painting really does come to be of prominence. And in that sense, he is the father of the Hudson River School, which never existed, as I like to remind my students. So he becomes eventually an Americanized citizen, a naturalized American citizen in 1834, but that is after he goes to Europe, and I'll be talking about that just briefly, but it's very important. From 1829 to 1832, he returns to London, and then goes to Paris and Italy. And there that we'll see will feed into his imagination and his art and how he deals with what America is like when he returns. As I mentioned, 1836, the date of this portrait, is a momentous year. It is a year in which he marries Maria Bartow, and it is also a year in which he then settles in Cedar Grove in Catskill, New York, which will be his home. And today you can go and see his home and studio there, not far from a place that some of you probably do know, which is Olana, Frederick Church's home in Hudson, New York. It's right south of that. Now, unfortunately, before we get that, I was mentioning Church. Church was born in Hartford, Connecticut, so he is New England born and very proud of that. His ancestors went all the way back to the first settlers who left Massachusetts to settle in Hartford, and he did paintings about that. And he will write to Cole in 1844 and ask him if he could come to Cedar Grove, to Catskill, New York, to follow him and study painting from him. Church, unlike Cole, had a very wealthy family and well-to-do, and so his early interest in art was encouraged, and it wasn't a kind of him struggling the way Cole did. And Church will not only learn from Cole, but he'll take subjects that Cole suggested, that Cole never got around to. So again, really fulfill Cole's promise. Because unfortunately, Cole dies at the age of 47 in 1848 from pleurisy. And it absolutely devastates the burgeoning American art scene. And it is Church then who carries on Cole's mantle to create this higher sort of landscape painting that we will see. And a type of landscape painting that I'll be referring to frequently, using the words of Cole from his great essay of 1836 that he gave as a lecture and then published in 1836, called Essay on American Scenery. So let's begin with, indeed, Cole's art. And a good way to begin is actually with trees. You're going to learn that trees are not just trees. They are expressive vessels in the art of Cole and Church. And as you look particularly at this one here, the one on the far left with the little feet, it looks like some kind of elderly dwarf or something walking around. And this kind of anthropomorphism is something that many romantic artists brought, but singularly Cole was an expert at it. And so in 1823 to 25, these are sketches on the far left that are done when he's walking around in the scenery of Pennsylvania, noticing trees and then showing a storm. Then we have 1827 on the right here. This is a detail of a painting about the last of the Mohicans based on Cooper's novel. And notice the Indian at the top, but anyhow, at the very top, he's going like this. Well, notice that tree, that large, what is called the blasted tree, that large tree with the cleavage through it and even the kind of knot opening. It's almost imitating him, right? It's almost like screaming even. And then down below from 1842, this is from Cole's Voyage of Life series, Maturity. We have this tree that's coming around and it's kind of going there. And then we have from Catterskill Falls, this tree that's twisting and changing like a human figure. And Church picks it up in his Niagara with this tree that looks like a human being along the waves of Niagara Falls. So all that is very much what we're going to see them doing. Well, a term that we want to use is the sublime, and I'll be talking about that. The sublime was the fearful, it was the awe-inspiring power of God through dangerous forces, hence the idea of the blasted tree versus the axe tree. The felled tree for Cole was a disaster. That was, a little development, okay, but he was fearful, and he wrote poems, The Lament of the Forest. He was agonized when his favorite oak tree was cut down in Catskill Falls when he came back from England. So he is very much here showing us nature and God's power. Now, he doesn't make this up on his own, of course. We have the importance of the sublime coming from a number of earlier artists, including the Baroque tradition in Italy and France, and in particular Salvatore Rosa. In fact, Cole becomes known as America's Salvatore. That's what they call him. And this is one of these artists that people were known by, Rosa or Salvatore, either way. So you see here this painting, a figure of the desolate landscape with the single hermit way down below. You can barely see him probably. But again, those very anthropomorphic, powerful trees. I had that over a sculpture that was a cat that many artists did drawings of, the Laocoon, which really represented the sublime. And that is, of course, this image of the Trojan priest who's being tormented by the gods. And that sense of death and torment and suffering by higher power than oneself is something that is part of the sublime. So Cole then imposes that on his landscapes. And so in 1825, he goes up to the Catskill Mountains. And he discovers this place. He also goes to the White Mountains. Later on, he'll go to the Adirondacks. But it's the Catskills that he really feels a symbiosis with. And there he starts painting, doing lots of drawings. That's mostly what he did. All these paintings, remember, are done in the studio. And then he'll do something like Sunrise in the Catskills, in which we see a very typical way that Cole painted, which is the idea of blockages. So notice we have this foreground, again with our very expressive tree, very Laocoon-like. We have almost like a rock that's like an altar, and notice this little rock here looks a lot like a skull. And then the mist leads us back. And in Cole's early work, in these early works, the sublime in which difficulty and trial are constantly present. And it's only in the distance, in the clear sky, or the mountain beyond, that we have a sense of repose, of a heavenly peace. Cole wrote famously, "There is no perfectibility in this world." He was more of a pessimist than his student Church, who will be a great optimist about the American promise. Whereas Cole, coming from England, and particularly the industrial part of England, had a more negative view of human activity. He was also, began as a staunch Calvinist. So we see these elements that are going on, and speaking of Calvinism, he very much is applying the writings of John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress to these canvases. Certainly the second most popular book at this time in America was Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, which figures Christian is the character who travels with Hopeful, his buddy, from the city of destruction to, of course, the celestial city of heaven. Well, there are specific places that he does paint of the Catskill Mountains. And again, this is part of Cole's genius, is to, first of all, create a place that becomes of interest through your art, to encourage tourism. Now, that in a sense is kind of a two-edged sword, because here's someone who's afraid of development, but at the same time, encouraging people to go and see this wilderness. And one of those famous falls that you can still see today is Catterskill Falls. And this is how it was spelled in the 19th century. And Catterskill Falls was commissioned, he got lots of patrons, commissioned by New York City merchant William Gracie. And for Thomas Cole, the falls were what? In whatever they appeared in the landscape, where they were the voice of the landscape. Whereas the calm lake was the eye of the landscape, almost like a mirror in it. And for him, the waterfall presents to the mind incongruous idea of fixedness and motion. Again, that romantic desire to harmonize two oppositions. So fixedness and motion. And where we see unceasing change and everlasting duration. Again, these are from his writing, Essay on American Scenery. Now what I have here, and I'm realizing maybe yellow wasn't the best color, but what we have here is him talking about trees and how he loves looking at trees in winter because there's so much more he can see in them. There's more effect, more force, I may say action, for I sometimes can almost imagine that they have life. The hemlock with its gray mossy head, arms over the trees of the forest, like a patriarch blessing his children. Some trees in a group, some trees intertwining their branches with others, as though in affection. The young supporting the aged, while others spread their branches easy and untroubled. So here you can see he's often thinking of them as human beings. Now here we have a great example of the sublime. Notice that we have this kind of blockage. In fact, if we go back to the Salvatore Rosa painting, notice how there is blockage there too, and then these dominant trees. We go up with this darkness, only a little bit of peace in the far right corner. And then we have almost no one visible, no evidence of human habitation, just a single figure on the precipice there, and this exploding falls, and of course a very expressive tree, almost looking like one of the Slender Man figures that students are worried about these days. These horror figures coming through. Well, here's Catterskill Falls. This is what it really looks like. And you can see it is a double falls that we have there, but Cole has certainly exaggerated. Now, when he went, he did a lot of drawings. And what we have here are drawings that he did. And I have a detail down below here of this one. And notice what we have. And at the top, you can see it too. We have actual habitation. We have actually what was, believe it or not, in 1825, a refreshment stand. Even back then. Catterskill Falls was already a tourist site. There was great fear that it was going to become what Niagara Falls had already become by 1825, which is full of stuff. But what's even more interesting to me is that Catterskill Falls was privately owned. It was not part of the state park. And there's a gate. And you had to pay 50 cents or $1 even to get that gate open so the falls will come down. And so you can experience it. So this is, again, this kind of touristic thing. So what does Cole do, of course, but he gets rid of any of those signs of activity. Notice, too, that he creates a sense of wilderness with an incredible sense of autumn. Notice how autumn pervades both of these scenes. This is, on your right, a painting that he did as kind of a pendant or companion work. And this was bought by Colonel Trumbull, who I mentioned earlier, as well as Daniel Wadsworth, one of the great from the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, Connecticut, and one of the great patrons of the day. And this is inside that this area here. So it's inside here, in there. And people would come inside and go up there and go inside, and they would wait for the waterfall to come down because they wanted to relive the experience of the deluge. And they would write about this. And they would write about the sublime fear of being in a cavern that's going to bury you alive. So this kind of Gothic horror, in a sense, experiencing with the landscape. But also a very American thing to read biblical meaning into natural forms. That goes back to the Puritans and Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. Cole himself described this falls. He said that the Catskill Clove, what we're seeing here, is one of savage and silent grandeur. Again, those are terms of the sublime. The spray of the cataract is a gush of living light from heaven, and is the lonely voice, the solitary song of the valley. And Cole himself is really trying to reinvent or reinvigorate wilderness in this place that's now being settled and becoming a touristic place. There's a big hotel already, Catskill Mountain House. People come to visit. The wilderness is yet a fitting place, he wrote in Essay on American Scenery, in which to speak of God, because the pathless solitudes are congenial to religious meanings. Now, if we come close, who are the individual figures? Who are these tiny figures? Let's go back. Notice there's a figure, again, right on the precipice, and one right there. Well, careful looking. We'll look here. No, it's not Cole. It's not an American. It is a Native American. It's true American, I should say. It is American Indian in Indian dress. He often painted them in these red tutu skirts and with red feathers. And notice that the trees behind them and around them echo that too. But notice that they're on the edge. They are alone. There's a sense again with autumn, which suggests death and decay, that indeed their time is short as well. And of course, the Indians were no longer residents of the Catskill Mountains. They had already been removed to reservations. And so Cole was bemoaning this as well, and really saw them as the original American, but also the kind of Adamic figure, Adam, the original Adam in America's Eden. They were symbols of the virgin wilderness. Now, Cole, again, at the same time, is doing biblical references and paintings. I'll be showing you some later, but I had to show you this one. I love this drawing. This is the devil throwing the monk over the precipice from 1828. And this idea, again, of this danger that the precipice brings. Now, this brings us to some philosophy that was important to him. Many theories he read, and one was by Archibald Allison, a British theorist, who talked about associationism. And associationism is the idea that you would have a train of associations from your experiences. And so here we have Archibald Allison actually writing, when any object, either of sublimity or beauty, is presented to the mind, I believe man is conscious of a train of thought being immediately awakened in his imagination. Again, very romantic idea. Analogous to the character of the expression of the original object. So, for example, reading stories, biblical stories, or stories of monks throwing devil, or the devil throwing the monk, that may indeed be sparked in your imagination as you look at a painting like Cole's. I wanted to show you one example, at least, of a southern landscape painter, and I thought I'd draw it from my own collection at the Georgia Museum of Art. This is George Cook, who spent a lot of time in Athens and Georgia and painting the areas, and painting what was the most popular tourist destination in the 1830s and 40s in the South, Tallulah Falls. Tallulah Falls, this is from 1841. This, like many of Cole's paintings, were bought by people who were part of the tourist industry. This is bought by R.L. Moss, who had a resort hotel in Tallulah Falls. And This painting is kind of also something that no longer exists. Because thanks to Georgia Power, Tallulah Falls no longer exists. It was called the Niagara of the South, by the way. And from Buffalo, New York, I say, I'm sorry, it's not Niagara Falls. But it was called the Niagara of the South. And here we see it in all its glory. Let me show you some details. And here we have more of the picturesque, and of course not the Native American, but instead people, including the artists, sketching, people holding on the trees, even a little foo-foo dog there. And yet, and even people, look at the little figures he has on the ledge of the falls, but he also does denote that there are some changes, burning of trees, for example, that is happening. So he's learning from Cole. Now, if we have the sublime, we also have to have the beautiful. These were the two modes of expression in landscape painting especially. And the beautiful was soft, reposeful, harmonious, suggestion of man and nature as one. And as Salvatore Rosa in the 17th century art was the model for American artists for the sublime, for the beautiful, it was the 17th century painter Claude Lorraine. And so when Cole later on in his career starts painting more images of the beautiful, he becomes known as, you got it, America's Claude. He goes from America's Salvatore to America's Claude. And so here we have Claude Lorraine, a pastoral landscape. Notice we have sheep, we have people, we have ruins, but everything is very ordered, and we have these framing trees. Well, this is what Cole gives us in the first of many paintings he will do of the area where he lived. And it will be one of his largest series, actually. And there's an exhibition that's opening this summer at Cedar Grove at the Catskill, at the Cole House of these series of paintings. And so this is of Catskill Creek, a view of Catskill Village here. Notice the calm water, but if you look really carefully, and on the bottom detail, you can see far to the left, there's a little bit of waterfall there, that was part of it. But we also have in the middle an ancient house, one of the earliest settlers were, of course, Dutch, the Van Vechten residents. Notice we have smoke coming up of home fires. But we also have a little dead tree right in the center there, in the detail. But we also have the pastoral. So we have three, yes, the Trinity, three sheep, the domestic, but also references to Jesus. Cole was very religious. And we have a stump, but notice it's full of new life. And if you look really carefully, right in the middle there is a couple of man and woman walking into the forest. And so the sense of peace. A very interesting detail that I don't have a super detail of, but way at the very top here is a little white square. That is the Catskill Mountain House. Again, that hotel that everyone is staying at. So he even includes that. But notice everything is peaceful here. It really is this idea of a place in which there is connections. However, Cole was always concerned about what was happening, particularly by 1827. Who is rising in power but Andrew Jackson, who will become president in 1829. Cole will be a vehement anti-Jacksonian, and he will be very concerned about the settlement of the West, the over-settlement, over-development. He hates what's happening in all the gambling. He said, Jacksonian America is a place full of things, not thoughts, and call about rabble-rousers and money grubbers. Well, what does he give us in this painting? But notice we have the trees, very much like Claude Lorraine, but right below that tree is a stump. And look at that stump. Does anyone see it? He creates a skull face looking right at us. Here it is. I love this. Here it is. Two eyes. And there's Thomas Cole's signature. So the dangers, again, that can happen if one goes too far, and kind of a face of prophecy in many ways. Well, as I said, Cole goes to Italy by way of London and Paris in 1829. But before he goes, there's a place, the icon at this time of America's sublimity, the natural icon was Niagara Falls. And even though Cole would write about it, and has thought about it, and others have painted it. He had never gone until May of 1829. Please note I said May of 1829 is when he goes. And he does 20 sketches, again, pencil sketches. He doesn't do much oil sketches. Pencil sketches. And he goes, and he then he goes to Italy, goes to London. And in London, he paints his interpretation of Niagara Falls, saying that no one had captured its sublimity yet, even though there were many images of it. And he does this sketch on the far left here, his study, which, by the way, is in this national park in Vermont, a small study, 1830. And notice again the very expressive dead tree. That is probably a reference to an eagle. There were many eagles that were associated with Niagara Falls. But remember I said he went in May. What season is he painting? He's painting autumn. And not only autumn, but dead autumn. I mean, we got blood red autumn. And that's what his final work is. And I'll give you one guess. I think you can see him. There's my detail. Well, who does he populate it with? Well, not the tourists who are flooding Niagara Falls. There's already a mummy museum. There's already people, taking barrels over the falls and all that. He doesn't show any of that. He gets rid of all the houses, everything. And he gives us 2 Native Americans. So again, this fear of what is happening to American wilderness. And this idea of preserving a lament, a loss of the American sublime, of America's purity. Because he had seen that lost in England. I mean, he was, it wasn't until 17 that he came to the United States. Well, this becomes so popular, and in fact becomes bought by a Mr. Bates, that it then becomes what? But a engraving for a very important book, which I have down here, John Hitton's History of America and Typography of America, and published in London. It then becomes, appears as a print on porcelain, so you can get your own coal that way, and including today. And this becomes then a symbol of America's natural icon of sublimity, and becomes a very popular one. Now, think about it. What happens, and this is 1830, what happens in May of 1830? Anyone know? That was the year, the month, that Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, beginning the Trail of Tears. And again, Cole being very conscious, very politically astute and aware, being very concerned about this as he's in England hearing about it. Well, however, Cole was not seen as the interpreter of Niagara Falls. That would be his student, Frederick Ellen Church. And when Church's 7-foot-long painting, really suggesting the breadth of the falls, premiered in 1857, and you see it below here, someone said, "This is Niagara," with the roar left out. They just need a roaring machine. And someone said, "Behold, the marvel of the Western world is before you." And they weren't talking about Niagara Falls. They were talking about Church's painting of Niagara Falls. For the first time, satisfied that even this awful reality is not beyond the range of human imitation. And it very much followed what Cole had to say about the Niagara Falls in his essay on American scenery in 1835. In its volume we conceive immensity, in its course everlasting duration, in its impetuosity uncontrollable power. These are the elements of its sublimity. Its beauty is garlanded around in the very hues of the water, in the spray that ascends the sky, in that unrivaled bow which forms a complete signature around the unresting floods. Well, that's what Church gets us. Cole didn't give us that. He didn't even give us the rainbow. But Church does. And look at how real the water is. But Church doesn't get rid of the signs of human settlement. He keeps Terrapin Tower. He keeps the various houses and all that. But yet he puts us right in the water. And we feel that we're like that tree, that anthropomorphic tree that looks back to the tree of Eden and the tree of the fall going over the water's edge. And Church, unlike Cole, did hundreds of oil sketches. Didn't only do drawings, but oil sketches. And traveled to Niagara Falls and painted in all seasons. And I just show you some of these. So he combines natural history with national history. But before we go back to Church, we must look at what Cole produces when he returns to America during the height of Jacksonian presidency. He comes back, is absolutely horrified by what is happening, being a Whig, and what he produces gets a great patron, Luman Reed, who unfortunately will die before the series is completed in 1836, but he begins in 1834, 5 large panels called The Course of Empire. And they are all the same size except for the middle one. They bring us, as you can see here, from the savage state to the Arcadian or pastoral state, to the consummation of empire, to the destruction of empire, to the desolation of empire. He was inspired by seeing, of course, the ruins of Rome, but also the poetry of Byron. Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which wrote about Rome as lone mother of dead empires. And also by the Bishop George Berkeley's 1726 very famous poem, Verses on the Prospect of Planting Arts and Literature in America, with the lines that close the poem, "Westward, the course of empire takes its way. The first 4 acts already past, a fifth shall close the drama with the day. Time's noblest offspring is its last." But Cole, who wrote in 1835, "There's no perfectibility in this world," and lamented about what was happening to America in Jackson's time, gives us a much more pessimistic view. And he wrote in his journal, "It seems to me that the moral principle of the nation is much lower than formerly, much less than vanity will allow." So he writes about this idea of a series of 5 paintings. Man in his progress from barbarism to civilization to luxury, to the vicious state or state of destruction, to the state of ruin and desolation. And then he said, very importantly, natural scenery also has its changes. And in fact, this was originally planned for Luman Reed's fireplace, his main parlor. They would be hung over the fireplace, and over it would have been 3 more panels. And he would have begun with the sun rising, the sun at noon, and the sun setting. And so he writes, natural scenery also has its changes. The seasons of the day and of the year. And indeed, each of these were seen as beginning with spring and ending with winter. Sunshine and storm. These justly applied will give expression, again the great romantic idea, expression to each picture of the series I would paint. It would be well to have the same locality in each picture. The location may be identified by the introduction of some striking object in each scene, a mountain of peculiar form, for instance. And so he gives us this peculiar form in each painting, and it undergoes changes as civilization becomes overwrought. And so we begin with the savage state. This is called an erratic rock. Cole, very interested in geology and time. And notice by the Arcadian state, it has calmed down. We also have Stonehenge, yes, referred to, and shipbuilding, but everything becomes greener. But by consummation of empire, what has happened? But now it's been overtaken by man and all of his architecture, and starts developing a face, and Cole loved faces and rocks. He anthropomorphized rocks too. And this kind of rock of ages, as it were, but looking kind of unhappy. And then we move to destruction, where everything is eroding, and finally to desolation, in which nature retakes from man again. And there is no human being at all. Everything has been overtaken again by nature. Now, Cole, because Luman Reed died, Cole was able to, his ancestors said, his family said he could own the piece and keep the paintings, show them, which he did. He displayed them. Some people were very upset by this American Jeremiah, this kind of warning to America. Will it be like Rome and fall? Yet others, of course, very much love this idea of a moral epic poem in paint. Well, Cole, however, while he was working on the first two paintings, he completed them. Luman Reed was still alive. He died very young at the age of 51. He was a very wealthy merchant, a grocer in New York City. But he asked Luman Reed if he could take a break and have a large exhibition painting that was more of actual natural scenery than this kind of historical fantasy landscape. And Luman Reed said, sure. And so what Cole did was this very famous painting, again, an icon of American landscape and American landscape painting. And that is a real view, a view from Mount Holyoke. You can go today and see this. Northampton, Massachusetts. After a thunderstorm, that's also very important. Cole loved storms that would then bring beauty in its wake afterwards. The Oxbow, 1836. Notice the size. It's 51 by 76 inches. Owned by the Metropolitan. Notice it too combines storm and calm, does it not? Well, in the recent exhibition of Cole's paintings, the Met discovered that underneath this painting that it's owned for a century, there is underdrawing of Cole's great middle picture of the course of empire. And that actually Cole, when he was working on two canvases of the exact same size in his studio. And so he was working on the view from Mount Holyoke as he was thinking about the consummation of empire. And they're exact same size. And sure enough, with radiographs, they discovered the underdrawing of Mount Holyoke is the architecture that he finally does in a separate canvas later with the consummation of empire. Now that's really interesting, because when we look at Mount Holyoke, what we discover is, again, this celebration of storm. He wrote a poem about, I sigh not for a stormless clime, but the blackness of the stormy day doth make the welcome calm more bright, in 1835, right before he does his painting. But it also echoes a painting he did in 1827-28, a biblical painting called Expulsion from the Garden of Eden. And in that painting, notice we have expulsion and activity and destruction, the sublime on the left, and the peace and calm, the beautiful of Eden on the right. Well, that's what he gives us in this real view, but again, based also on experiences of landscape. Well, Thomas Cole, in his essay in American Scenery, ends it with this statement: we are still in Eden. The wall that shuts us out of the garden is our own folly. And he's doing this when he then comes up with the course of empire and then does this painting, which is in a way a kind of play on this, but using a real American landscape. And also putting expulsion, as it were, in there as a warning. So here we have the two trees, very much the sublime. Notice Cole even gives us the lightning right below the branch there. And then we have, I love this tree stump. It's like a pointing finger, right? It's his hand. Pointing up, it points up to here, points here, and here. Well, what is it pointing to? It's pointing, first of all, and I have to give Elizabeth Kornhauser, the curator at the Met, credit for this. It's pointing to those birds over the sumacs and white pines, which were actually there. And notice that those birds create what? A question mark, which is not unlike the question mark shape of the oxbow. And then it also points, notice, towards those mountains. And what's in that mountain but deforestation? And so Cole is giving us still something that's at the pastoral state. It's still that ideal, that Jeffersonian ideal. But we have transportation, but not the railroad, not the railroad that has just cut across his beloved Catskill Mountains, and he is not happy, and he does a painting about that. But what we have is simple forms of transportation. It's still in home fires, agriculture. It's still pastoral, but what will it become? And notice who is, let me go back a minute here, who is down here, painting, but Cole himself, looking out to us as, again, beware, be careful, keep this bright. And his signature is on the wonderful umbrella and sketchbook there. Well, that brings us to Frederick Evan Church again. And Church had in his mind, of course, these great works by Cole, and creates his own polypic, his own kind of course of empire, but it's not really a course of empire, it's a course of natural scenery and American scenery. And when I say America, I mean North and South America. And what he gives us are huge paintings, 7 feet across. The largest is actually the one I showed, the smallest, the Heart of the Andes, 116 inches across. He does Twilight in the Wilderness. He does the icebergs, which he called the North in 1861, as the Civil War is now brewing. And then we have Cotopaxi from 1862. Now, we're not going to look at all 5 of these, but think of them as a movement from the sublime and the savage state to the pastoral, to danger, to sacrifice, to an apocalyptic explosion. Now, before that, I did want to show you that Church, like Cole, painted his own New England scenery. He painted the West Rock, New Haven, which is a work from 1849, and he did this for Cyrus Field, who was a good friend of his, a merchant in Hartford, Connecticut, again, where Church was from. And West Rock was very famous. It was a political space. It was a place where those Cromwellians hid from British agents and wrote famously, "Opposition to tyrants is obedience to God," inside the great West Rock. And you can go today and see this. And in his painting, he has a steeple right by that. So this is also a pun, because what do we have but a harvesting field? And Cyrus Field. And plus, Church put churches in his paintings as a way of double signing his work. He would sign his letters with little church steeples. So here we have a tribute to the American independence and the idea of prosperity that came from leaving the British, etc. Then he actually made one trip to the American South, and that was in 1851. And he went with Cyrus Field and his wife, and that was to the Natural Bridge, Virginia, and did this painting for Cyrus Field too. And I think we can see these as pendants, again, as paintings that could be hung together. They were even owned by the same person. So we have the New England Rock, West Rock, and we have the wonderful arch of Natural Bridge, which, remember, Jefferson owned and talked about it as the emblem of the sublime, the most sublime of nature's works. And remember, also, George Washington actually wrote his initials on the arch, bad boy. And then down below we have an African American. Isn't that interesting? After the Fugitive Slave Act has been passed, we have an African American guy pointing out to George Washington's initials to this woman who's dressed in red, white, and blue, the American flag below. Church was, of course, a very Union man, and very concerned with what was happening to America. And we see that played out in these 3 paintings that I'm going to now finish up with. The Heart of the Andes, this, by the way, is a reproduction of the actual frame Church had made for it. Notice it's like a window, like you would walk through, and people, by the way, were so astounded by his detail that they brought opera glasses. Mark Twain said of the Heart of the Andes, he said, "Your mind is spinning around to take all the wonder in." There's so much to see. And then 1859, that becomes his great success after Niagara Falls, after Niagara. Then we have Twilight in the Wilderness from 1860, and then Cotopaxi, 1862. Again, Heart of the Andes, the largest. Now, the Heart of the Andes was a product of 2 trips that Church took, and he did other ones before this, but this was the kind of the ultimate. that he took following the footsteps of Alexander von Humboldt, who Harper's Weekly called the greatest man in the world. And Alexander von Humboldt traveled to South America and wrote a book called Cosmos, a sketch of the universe. I always, that title always makes me laugh. A sketch of the universe, which is all about South America. I mean, South America is a microcosm of the universe. And Church follows him in his travels to the Andes and to the great volcanoes like Cotopaxi and Cayambe. And he does all these oil sketches. And then he comes back to New York and creates this compilation. This is not, if you tried to go to the Andes and see this, you wouldn't. It is many places put together. It's the heart of the Andes. Just like Niagara Falls, even it's called Niagara, right? Not Niagara Falls, Niagara. So here, the heart of the Andes. And it had a pamphlet, a 64-page pamphlet to go with it, as well as an engraving and special viewing at night. And he had curtains around it, and he had botanical elements. And this is where he met his wife, Isabel. He was peeping out through the curtain, looking at people wonder at his paintings, and he saw Isabel, and then they got married. So anyhow, very happy. So Theodore Winthrop, who was a writer and accompanied Church on many of his travels, wrote about polar scenes are here colonized under the hot equator. Again, those oppositions. Eternal snows climb out of eternal summer. All of the Earth's riches are compacted into one many-sided crystal. In the heart of the Andes, Mr. Church, that guy, Mr. Church has condensed the condensation of nature. And he was called the Humboldt of American painting. This picture is to teach the majesty of power in repose, which is what they said of Niagara Falls with the rainbow is power in repose. The dome was the emblem of permanent and infinite peace. They called it the demigod. One is overtaken by the great white throne of the Almighty. So again, reading the landscape as signs of God's power. And we get details here. And here's the savannah. There's the church down below. And you can see how detailed Church's paintings are. Unlike Cole you see brushstrokes. Not Church. It gets more and more detailed. But this, I love this. So Winthrop goes, on the reaches of this savannah is space and flowery pasturage for flocks and herds. Llamas may feed there undisturbed by anacondas. You have to worry about the serpent. No serpent hugs. No scorpion nips. Never a mosquito hums over all this fair realm. Perpetual spring reigns, because it's the equator. Life here may be as sweet idle. We are safe in our paradise in the heart of the Andes. This is the embodiment of American manifest destiny. We're not even going to move to the west. We're moving south. And this is, of course, this idea of the Monroe Doctrine and all of this. And we're going to, this is our original Eden. And Church gives us what? Not only him in the tree, that's his signature with a spotlight on it so you don't miss it, next to the bird of paradise, but a pathway and a cross with the natives who happen to be in red, white, and blue, thank you very much, and the waterfall, which Winthrop calls a symbol of the feminine versus the masculine of the Cordilla. Well, a year follows. He actually goes up to Labrador and is going to paint with Reverend Noble, who is the biographer of Cole, and they do a book, Icebergs, Chasing Icebergs with a Painter, and he's going to do a big painting, but he doesn't do that. He comes back, and in 1860 he does this, Twilight in the Wilderness. So we were down in South America, now we're back up north, and the north that was immediately recognized as the most wilderness space in New England, Maine. And notice, it's of course 1860. What has happened in 1859? John Brown's raid. Dred Scott decision before that. Church talked about all these politics all the time. And what we have here is a painting which will then be in William Walter's collection. He'll buy it. But it is a painting that is, again, twilight in the wilderness, like Heart of the Andes. It's a condensation. So it's not an actual place. He evokes Mount Katahdin. He evokes the rivers. He evokes the deep forests of New England. But he gives us all these symbols that he had learned from Cole. And so what do we have? In the front, I have the detail there, a stump with a hidden cross. See that little cross? In the sky, look up in the sky, what do we have? A face, Jehovah, the angry God. On the side, we have heart, larkspur, hemlock trees, like the three Marys, with the dead branch, almost like a Pietà figure of Christ, reaching towards the sky with the little cloudlet, is almost like a dove of the Holy Spirit. And when it was exhibited, people read this biblically. They read it as an apocalyptic painting. And so as I have here, someone wrote, "Solitude reigns over the scene, as the eye ever turns away from the wilderness below to gaze upon the brilliant canopy of the sky, the imagination whispers that he who was once led up of the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted, Jesus Christ, must often at the twilight hour have turned his gaze from gloom and loneliness of the forest to the brightness and beauty of those heavens, which to his vision of faith were ever opened, revealing the Father of lights." So they read this biblically. They read it apocalyptically. And I hope you notice the color of that sky. You can't get more red and blue than that. And sure enough, a year later, church does our banner in the sky. Takes that tree, which, by the way, here on the far right, the far left, has an eagle on it. He takes that tree, gives us, this is based actually in a poem by Drake called Our Banner in the Sky. Very popular, made in a popular print you could buy, from a lithograph, very small as you can see. And also then in 1864, as it's clear that the North is going to win, he does this painting, our flag, in which he again gives us that eagle down below and the Rock of Ages with the flag rising above it. Well, that brings us, however, from 1860 of Twilight in the Wilderness to 1862. Remember, in the middle is icebergs, which has its own reference as a mast that's a cross above sacrifice. It's called the North when it was shown in London, and those were called cathedral-like icebergs. But I want to finish, well, not quite finish, but get close to finishing with Cotopaxi from 1862. And here, this painting that's owned by the wonderful Detroit Institute of Arts, he once again is revisiting Expulsion of Adam and Eve by Cole, by his mentor Cole. And here we have Cotopaxi, a real volcano. This is based on things he saw, but again, pulling it all together and creating that higher sort of landscape painting, that symbol of the sublime, and a lesson, a moral lesson for us to look at, a kind of warning in the middle of the Civil War of 1862. And so we have down below Eden with a woman in red, white, and blue with a white llama. How nice, red and blue, and then we got the white llama. There walking with those beautiful trees that reach towards the waterfall coming down. Think of water and baptism. And then we have that calm part of water. And what do we have but what was called the newly risen sun? Yes, S-U-N, but S-O-N too. And notice, what does that newly risen sun form but a cross? And then we have the exploding volcano. What is so interesting is this painting was bought by James Lennox, who also collected Turner, and church was influenced by Turner. And he owned not only the greatest American and European art collection in New York, but the greatest library. He was a bibliophile. He owned a Gutenberg Bible. And so he is, again, this biblical thinking is going on both for church and his patrons and the viewers. And so what we have is this explosion of darkness and light, just as Cole gave us in the Expulsion, yet hope with the white birds in our far bottom left, bottom right, and what do we have? The New York Tribune talked about the volcano as the city of God, volcanoes crested with the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. That's right from the Bible. Pillars of warning rather than of guidance, like those which led the Israelites. We always called ourselves the New Israelites, and those references were made to Cole's churches and Cole's paintings. Led the Israelites out of the land of bondage, sulphurous before the God of day, the newly risen sun burns with portentous heat. And let me remind you, who writes the Battle Hymn of the Republic in 1862? But Julia Ward Howe, February of 1862. This painting then is going to be exhibited. And it's a battle song, of course. The battle is a test from God for America's redemption. And Emerson himself talked about the Civil War as a test from God for America for its original promise of the American Revolution. So she writes in that song, "He has sounded forth the trumpet that shall never call retreat. He is sifting out the hearts of men before his judgment seat. Our God is marching on." And so that would very much resonate as people saw this painting and revisit it. But I want to end on not an apocalyptic note, but on a note of promise and unity. Now, Church and his beloved wife Isabel unfortunately had a horrible personal tragedy just as the Civil War was wrapping up in March of 1865. In March of 1865, within 3 weeks of each other, their beloved young son and daughter died of typhoid. They lost both of them. And this, of course, absolutely destroyed Church. And he did a kind of another Twilight in the Wilderness that's a lot about that, as well as the war. But then he and his wife go to Jamaica as the war is ending. And they go to St. Vale Thomas in Jamaica. He does many paintings, but he does this painting when he returns in 1866. The war is ended. And they find out that Isabel is pregnant again. So now it's an image of hope. But not just hope for them, a personal hope, but of course a hope for the nation. A nation to be reunited, not with one, but two rainbows of promise. And two rainbows of promise that create this beautiful semicircle connecting a barren rocks with this tropical lushness. And this idea of north and south now will be one again. The nation has survived. And so too has his family. And I think it's fitting that he does this painting, we come full circle back to Niagara, that ultimate American icon of sublimity of the nation's promise that he did with a single rainbow. Well, now, North and South, North America and South America, are united in one in this brilliant conception of how one can create icons of landscape painting by one of the greatest icons of mid-19th century American landscape, Frederick Edmund Church, thanks to his mentor, the other great icon, Thomas Cole. Thank you very much for your... I'm happy to answer any questions. I know we ran over a little bit, but not too bad. They took my time. Anyone have a question? Now I'm happy to talk to you afterwards. Yeah, yeah.
I was just wondering if you didn't mention Emerson. Volume, please.
He said he doesn't. He didn't mention. I didn't mention Emerson. I did mention Emerson briefly, but.
But what's the relationship between, I would say, Cole more than Church? Of course, was there any philosophical?
No, none at all. Actually, Cole is very. First of all, he's a Trinitarian, as is Church. He's not a Unitarian. I would argue John Frederick Kempsett. Actually, that was what I wrote my master's thesis on, Kempsett and Emerson, and also the Crayon, which is written in part by William J. Stillman, who studies with John Ruskin. He actually is good friends with Emerson and Charles Eliot Norton. And so it's by the 1850s that Emerson's philosophy becomes much more embodied in landscape. But I must say, who was Thomas Cole's best friend? But William Cullen Bryant, who was a Unitarian. But Emerson's idea of a transcendental nature that provides harmony and unity was not Cole. Cole was very much this pessimistic view very much frightened by what was happening politically and all that. Though certainly Emerson and Church and Cole would have shared concern of what's happening to African Americans, what's happening to Native Americans. Emerson, of course, was our great philosopher, but his idea of a God in nature, but not having the miracles, not having, Cole became an Episcopalian. You can't get more high church than that. Certainly not Emerson's Unitarian Transcendentalist mindset. But it is important. And in fact, when I became interested in art history, well, actually when I became interested in American art in undergrad, I became interested in art history when I was 12, but when I became interested in art history in undergrad, that was my goal, was to find out the connections between Emerson and American landscape painting. And I kind of did it with my dissertation, actually. I was reading LeCran and I see these words, and, oh my goodness, this is Emerson. And they even quote some of his poetry. And then I discovered recently, I just read a new essay for the American Pre-Raphaelite catalog, the show that's opening in April at the National Gallery. And they had a journal called The New Path. And that journal ends with, literally, the last words are Emerson's. They're a poem by Emerson. And it echoes Emerson very much throughout.
I guess I was continuing my question. Was there any reaction to Emerson's philosophy that they were reacting to? Was it a reaction to Emerson?
I don't know. I don't know. Cole's never, I'm not aware of Cole even mentioning Emerson, though he may have been familiar because of William Cullen Bryant. But even Bryant's poetry is still very much the sense of the present moment, but then death and then even heaven. Where Emerson's much less that way. Because Emerson himself very much at one point acknowledges evil. He too loses his beloved brother, and he too loses a child. So a sense of tragedy, he comes to understand that there is tragedy in the world. In the 1850s, his essay Compensation is part of that, and Fate, he writes an essay called Fate. But he's more seen as this idea of self-reliance and the oversoul. Emerson did, of course, travel and do a lot of the Lyceum circuit, but I don't think they're specifically reacting to Emerson per se. Good question, though. Emerson's important. He's the man. Anyone else? Yes, Chris.
Well, Janice, hearing you speak again, I felt like I should be taking notes. Old habits die hard. Can you tell us anything more about the double rainbow? The concept of the double rainbow.
Well, it was, there was these wonderful books on not only clouds but rainbows, which Church had studied and read about, as did Turner. And Turner famously would do double rainbows too. And the double rainbow, I've actually seen double rainbows in England, they do exist. And of course, how he does it here, it really becomes almost like a single rainbow of unity. But again, if you look at how he paints rainbows, though, he really captures that sense of light. It's not like a flat rainbow without that incredible sense of light. He understood the science. Church was a scientist, an explorer, as well as a great naturalist and nationalist painter. For him, very much, unlike Cole, people often equate Cole with the kind of promise of America, but Cole saw more the dangers, whereas Church is very much this idea of much more of the optimist, and that way he shares Emerson, and this idea of the American promise, and is really conveying that here, I think. Thank you so much for your attention. Appreciate it very much.